Good evening, Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to Cambodia Global Dialogue of Southeast Asia TV. Tonight, I have the pleasure to have with me Her Excellency, Deputy Secretary and Ambassador to ASEAN from Australia, Mrs. Ambassador Gillian. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes. As you all know, this year Cambodia is chairing the ASEAN, and as part of this chairmanship, Cambodia will be hosting many different events, two major summit, foreign minister meeting with dialogue partner. So it is in this context that I have the pleasure to have with us today the ambassador to share with us a bit the prospect of this year chair, the relation with Australia, the relation of ASEAN, not just with Australia but with the larger East Asia. So in this context, we hope to be able to let you have a perspective a bit on not just Cambodia, not just ASEAN, because so far we've been talking a lot about Cambodia and ASEAN, but here we're going to enlarge a bit the scope to cover a much larger, East Asia. So, Ambassador, before we start, perhaps I like to ask you to say a bit about your professional background a bit for the audience.
Sure. Well, thank you. As you said, I'm Australia's ambassador to ASEAN. It's my first ambassadorial appointment. I'm a member of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which I joined back in 1980. And I've been working very much on regional Southeast Asian issues and issues to do with the United Nations since I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But in recent years, my focus has very much been on ASEAN, which has been a very exciting time for us and for ASEAN itself.
Yes. Well, for this year, we expect for Cambodia to have the honor to host not just the summit, but also summit and related or summit. From your perspective, coming from, here you ambassador to ASEAN, but from Australia as a good friend of Cambodia, from this context, what do you see the prospect of this year in the larger context?
Well, this is a really important year for ASEAN and for ASEAN's role in the broader regional community. As you said, Australia's worked very closely with Cambodia over the years and also with ASEAN. And in fact, we're delighted that we are the very first dialogue partner of ASEAN. That's countries outside of ASEAN which established formal relations. We were the first country to do that back in 1974, so it goes back a really long way. And we've always supported ASEAN's efforts to help build peace, stability and prosperity in the region. And I suppose looking at this year, it's really a critical year for ASEAN because you're now only a couple of years off your goal of building an ASEAN community by 2015. So an economic community, social, cultural community. That's a really big goal, and it's one that we strongly support. And in fact, I think that ASEAN often doesn't get the credit it deserves outside the region for having helped transform Southeast Asia from what was when it was created in 1967. If you think back then, tension and the problems in the region to what is now a very peaceful, prosperous and stable region. So ASEAN's role in that has been critical, and 2015 is a critical goal. But as you said, ASEAN is now also at the centre of bigger groupings.
Exactly.
And Australia, we're delighted that we're in a lot of those groupings. And the most recent of those groupings is called the East Asian Summit.
And how old is the East Asia Summit?
Well, it was created in 2005, so again fairly new in Kuala Lumpur. And it started with 16 members. So it had the ASEAN 10, plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, New Zealand. But what happened at the end of last year at the Bali summit is you've got two new, US and Russia.
Exactly.
So you now have 18 countries, and this will be their second meeting here when they meet in Phnom Penh in November. So a critically important meeting of this new grouping, which brings together really all of the major players in this part of the world. So you've got all of the major countries meeting at leaders level, and they have a mandate to discuss everything that matters: political, security, economic.
It's a leader-led,
and it's leaders-led, which is we think that's important. I mean, ministers can do certain things, but it's really leaders who are the ones who can make the big decisions.
What do you see the challenge facing the region that this East Asia Summit should and be able to tackle?
I think really it's got two big challenges.
Yes.
I mean, this is now known. Everyone talks about the Asia. This is the Asia century.
Yes.
You know, political, strategic weight, economic weight is coming to this part of the world. What we want to see is that this part of the world continues to become the driver of economic growth. It continues to have that major role, but that we also preserve peace and stability in the region.
Yes.
And there are still a number of regional flashpoints and issues that need to be managed sensitively.
Yes.
And we think a grouping that brings together all of those key players can help ensure that, as I said, the region stays peaceful, it manages tensions, but can also economically keep growing.
Yes, I think, for the region to grow economically, we need trade, we need economic relation, and you cannot have that without stability. I think this region is so dependent on trade. Let's face it,
absolutely.
maritime security is very important.
Yep.
And so you're going to be all tackling from this sort of like security, traditional, non-traditional security, the larger prospect there.
Well, we think that the East Asian Summit can deal with the whole suite of traditional and non-traditional issues. Really, all issues.
A lot of people don't understand this non-traditional. We know the traditional security issue, but non-traditional. Give me an example.
Oh, things like piracy. Some people talk about climate change is a non-traditional threat.
Right?
It's that suite of things which aren't the traditional hard military issues, but they are counterterrorism, piracy. They're all illegal fishing.
Would disaster management considered as one of this?
Disaster management does have what we also call a soft security side.
Yeah.
Because when you deal with a disaster, to deal with it effectively, you need to have militaries of countries working together and handling those issues. And this is a very disaster-prone region. So one of the issues which East Asian leaders, in fact, at Bali last year, they ticked off on a major initiative to help enhance the region's ability to work together to combat disasters. It was an Australian-Indonesian proposal. We've suffered, as has Cambodia, floods.
Thailand.
We have bushfires as well. There have been typhoons, cyclones in the region. So what we would like to see is the countries of East Asia work together as effectively as possible, so that when there is a disaster, the next time we have a really big disaster like the Asian tsunami, that we can respond quickly and effectively.
I see.
And I think that's what the people of the region want. That's where we can add value.
Yes. Any other area you think that will be tackling that not from the challenge side, but more the opportunity to strengthen the collaboration? Since you have all the major player in the region and outside the region as well.
I mean, you talked a little bit about the trade. I mean, this is a part of the world which is very dependent on trade links. We're all major exporting nations. That's the growth model in Asia has been very much built on exports. So what can we do to one, keep the region open, resist protectionism? It's really important that we don't go down the protectionist route. So how can we work together to resist protectionism? How can we open up the opportunities in our trade dealings with one another in the outside world? And there's a whole...
Would you be pushing a bit on the, reinvigorating the Doha round?
Yeah, look, we would like to see the Doha round succeed. It's been it's a difficult task. These multilateral negotiations, particularly when they involve so many different countries, can be very hard to bring to conclusion. But multilateral solutions are the best in terms of a free trade agenda globally. But we think you can complement that with regional and bilateral arrangements. So we have a very good free trade agreement, for example, with ASEAN. There's an Australia-New Zealand ASEAN free trade agreement. We have bilateral agreements with Singapore and Thailand, and we're negotiating with Malaysia and Indonesia. But what we would like to see is there's a lot of different free trade arrangements in this part of the world. How could we perhaps bring them together? And with ASEAN at the core.
How do we untangle the rule origin, what we call the bowl noodle.
The noodles.
Yeah,
And it can be very difficult if you try and put
yes.
them all on a piece of paper. There are so many, but ASEAN is trying, and we think this is a very good idea, to look at how can you bring together, for example, all of the ASEAN FTAs. You've got ASEAN's got FTAs, I said, with Australia and New Zealand,
Yes.
with China, Japan, Korea, India. Could you have something like an ASEAN plus
Yes.
FTA? So could you bring all of those different
Streamline,
FTAs together?
Yeah.
And so that's something we think is worth supporting, and we strongly support ASEAN's efforts to see what we can do amongst that group of really 16 countries who
Yes.
have, so the 10 ASEANs and the six countries with FTAs with ASEAN.
I think ASEAN now, as being a rule-based organization with its own charter, is a much more confident organization than before. And this centrality is very important, and the fact that Australia is on board on this idea that how do we sort of like streamline all this single track FTA to have more a comprehensive holistic approach. This to me would link to something that is very dear to my heart, which is more the private sector, because the private sector, for them, it's very difficult for them to understand all this complex rule, right? Where I have to deal with India one, I have to deal with China one, with Australia one. How do we streamline? How do we find a much more user-friendly, if I can use that language, right? So this is something that you would like to see happen.
No, and I think the other thing about the FTAs is, how do you make sure, as you said, that the private sector, it's all well and good for governments to negotiate these agreements. How do we make sure that the private sector is aware of the opportunities and takes advantage of them? And that's one thing. Governments aren't always the best at interacting necessarily with the private sector and making sure that we explain what we've done, but we're putting a lot of effort, for example, with the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA to what we call outreach to the private sector. So it's one thing to negotiate this FTA, which is the biggest FTA we've ever negotiated. If you look at ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand region, you're talking about economies, so 12 economies with a GDP of over 3 trillion, population of well in excess of 600 million, so a really, really big market. But how do we make sure that our private sectors take advantage of that? So it's incumbent on governments to do a lot more work with the private sector. So explaining what's there, talking to them about it, and then secondly, as you said, trying to streamline some of these processes, trying to the extent that we can, bring the different FTAs together. But it's an important task.
I think, at the end of the day, like for example this year, our theme is a one community, one destiny, and it's very philosophical, but behind that is a lot issue about the people connectivity. I think if we can just stick with the word connectivity itself, a lot of people would think would just react, say, oh, connectivity is about linking our transport system, our railroad, our trade, but I think all these things will not happen without the people.
No, that's right.
So here I see you mentioned the combined mass, the critical mass of the market combined of ASEAN plus. This region is and will be the motor of growth, the source of growth to pull the world. As you know, in the context of the difficult situation in the Eurozone, for example, so I think, how do we look for way that make the ASEAN community number one, integrate, right? I say it's important. But then once you integrate, say, which is not far away, 2015, but after that you have to make that connectivity with the ASEAN dialogue partner, with Australia, with New Zealand, with India, with China, and this will be to me the biggest challenge of our lifetime now. That to make this a reality,
And I think you put your finger on it. The people-to-people links are fundamental to making this work, and that covers a whole range of things, from tourists to people who migrate to educational exchanges, and I think education is a really important one. The more we can have our different educational institutions work together, the more that our students can benefit from each other's education institutions, have exchanges. that's the kind of thing
Yes.
that will help, I think, build that kind of community, not just ASEAN, but
Yeah.
broader.
You know, it's in ASEAN we always talk about, you know, the ASEAN, the early ASEAN were much more developed, and then the later ASEAN, which is less developed, and you're talking about the effort to bridge the development gap. And you touch on a good point on the issue of you know, education. You cannot reduce development gap if the people are not educated. And you touch the issue on how, you know, we can look at the, for me I look more from the economic side, right? I mean, education could be an education side, but for me I see in the context of ASEAN plus dealing with our dialogue partner, all of them are much more advanced in terms of economy, you know. So how do we make the linkage in making the service provider to reach out also to in this case I take for example Cambodia, Laos for example, you know, linking good university, you know, so that the people here would have access to good education. You know, of course those who, the rich one, don't worry about that, they will send their kids anyway. But look, we're dealing with the mass. The mass cannot afford to fly away. So through this connectivity we could bring the service, this education service to the country. And this to me is part of the realization of ultimately of this community.
No, and one of the, we talked a bit about the East Asian Summit before. One of the priority areas is education. And last year was the first time that the EAS Ministers for Education had got together, and they've ticked off on a program and a plan, and part of that is designed to help, as you said, how can we ensure that all of those within the East Asian region can most take advantage of the different educational opportunities that we each have to offer. And certainly Australia is very keen to play a part in that. We have a lot of Southeast Asian students in Australian institutions. We have over 100,000 Southeast Asian students, and they're extremely welcome to our institutions, and they make a huge contribution to our university life. But we also have Australian universities and institutions who have campuses offshore, increasingly in the region. But what we would also like to see is more Australian students studying here in Southeast Asia. So it's a two-way thing.
It's a two-way street.
Through scholarships, through linking educational institutions, recognition of each other's degrees. What can we do to facilitate that flow within this region?
Coming from Australia, you know, visiting Cambodia, in the year where Cambodia is chairing, what is your expectation from that Cambodia should deliver?
Well, as I said, we're delighted to see Cambodia in the chair of ASEAN. It comes around every 10 years for Southeast Asian countries. It is a huge workload being in the ASEAN chair, precisely because ASEAN has built up such a network within ASEAN and beyond of meetings and dialogues. It's an incredibly heavy schedule, so we certainly wish Cambodia all the best in this year of managing the various meetings. In terms of what Cambodia plans to achieve, well, as I said, we think it's the final stage of the ASEAN community building process, and I know you talked to Dr. Sarin not so long ago. So this will be a critical year for ASEAN with Cambodia in the chair. We would also hope to see some progress in the broader ASEAN set of meetings on the challenges and opportunities facing the region. Certainly for our part, disaster management, we hope that will go forward. Education, those sorts of issues. But it's very much for Cambodia as host to, in a sense, drive the agenda. But we are certainly looking forward to working very closely with Cambodia.
Where last I cannot help but to bring in the issue a bit on the G20. You know, as Cambodia chair, you know, our Prime Minister will be honored to be invited to Mexico. To address in his capacity as chair. What do you see now? I see the role of the G20 in tackling this global issue, like, you know, on even on environment, you know, sustainable development, of course the financial crisis, that sort of thing. Where do you see, you know, ASEAN per se fitting, you know, in terms of contributing its input into this global recovery.
Yeah, that's a really good point. As we said earlier on, given that this is now the centre, the driving force of economic growth in the region, what happens here is going to be really important for global growth. We're a member of the G20, Australia is one of the G20 members, and we strongly supported, for example, the idea that ASEAN should be present at G20 meetings through the chair. So we're delighted to see that Cambodia will be at the Mexico meetings this year. And I do think this part of the world, East Asia, has a real contribution to make in ensuring that, I mean, we got through the global financial crisis, we're dealing with the European issues. How can we ensure issues such as not resorting to protectionism, which would be disastrous for the countries in this region who are major exporters? How can we ensure that the world doesn't go down that path, but instead stays on an open trading path? I think the G20 too, if you look at the membership, it's diverse enough and representative enough that it can in fact probably go beyond economic issues. That's and that was the raison d'etre of the group, looking at economic issues, and it played a critical role in helping get through the global financial crisis. But I suppose we also ask ourselves, can it do more? And we think there is potential for that grouping to address a broader suite of issues, and we would like to see ASEAN play a part in that.
Australia will be the chair in 2014, no?
2014,
2014.
2014. So it's going to be a big.
Then it's synchronized with Myanmar.
Indeed.
Chairing ASEAN.
So Myanmar will be chairing ASEAN in 2014. We'll be chairing the G20, and 2014 is also the 40th anniversary of Australia's dialogue partner relations with ASEAN. So it'll be a very big year for us all.
Yes. Well, Ambassador, as I told you before, 30 minutes go very fast. Unfortunately, we are on the 28th minute already. So, what is your last word? Well, what's your message to Cambodia?
Well, I suppose you've got in Cambodia. Cambodia has Australia as a close friend. We have been delighted to have worked closely with Cambodia in recent years. We want to continue to work with Cambodia. This is a really big year for Cambodia. Hosting ASEAN, an enormous workload, but it's also a tremendous opportunity for Cambodia, in a sense, to showcase itself to the world. I've been incredibly impressed. I've been to Cambodia many times in recent years, and I must say each time I come to Cambodia, it looks more and more dynamic, more and more impressive. It's a beautiful city, Phnom Penh. So I think this year it's a bit like hosting the Olympics. It's the Olympics, but more for bureaucrats. So, but no, this will be an opportunity, I think, for Cambodia to really showcase itself, and we're looking forward to playing our part in that.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador, for give us your precious 30 minutes to share your perspective to the Cambodian audience here. And for us, this year is important for us. I like to say that if you count from the Paris Peace Accord 93, we almost hit 20 years. And it's been 20 years of development, 20 years of partnership, with a country like Australia. And Australia should be happy and proud to see that one of your grandchild, because let's face it, Australia was part. Your foreign minister,
indeed,
was involved in the Paris Peace Accord, that sort of thing. And to see that nearly 2 decades later, Cambodia be in position to play a larger role in the region, a larger role in the wider region of ASEAN, and also to be a player making input to the G20. So this is sort of like a closing a chapter in a way, moving from a post-crisis country to a normal country, So this is something that I like the audience to remember from what our short discussion here. So once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Well, we're coming to the end of the program, and I hope you have a chance to have a glimpse on how complex the issue, that this country, as chair ASEAN, will be tackling. Not just about Cambodia. We're not talking about Cambodia. We're talking about the region. We're talking about not just ASEAN, but the larger region, ASEAN plus many other countries. So the issue is not easy, it's not simple, it's not just about economics, not just about trade. Everything is linked, you know, from security, maritime security, to terrorists, to I don't know. It's so complex. Sometimes you wonder, does Cambodia have the capacity, the capability to tackle all that? But fortunately, I think with good friends like Australia and many other countries who are teaming up to help Cambodia in this year, we hope that Cambodia will do a good job for that. And I hope to have more speakers coming in the next several weeks to share more different perspective on different part of this year ASEAN Chairmanship. So on that note, I want to say good night.